whenever you do these studies or ask open-ended questions about business climate, business people take that as an invitation to complain about taxes that they'd rather not pay, regulations they'd rather not comply with. So it's almost like complaining about the weather. It's something that is part of the background. It's better in my mind to understand what's happening with the economy, to look at actual economic indicators to see how well the economy is performing. And we have some good data for the Oregon economy that are put together not based on anecdotal complaints from local business people, but really objective economic comparisons based on data that are done by arguably impartial outsiders who rank how well cities and states are doing. And for the most part, they point to a long-term trajectory for Oregon in which it's doing relatively well.
Hey, everyone. Thanks for joining us today on Policy for the People. I am Juan Carlos Ordóñez with the Oregon Center for Public Policy. If you follow the news, you may have heard a lot about Oregon's business climate of late, and especially how Oregon's business climate is supposedly terrible. And these arguments that Oregon's business climate and economy are doing awful are being said most loudly by Oregon's business community itself. But is there any validity to these arguments? To get to the bottom of this, I spoke with economist Joe Cortright, who runs the think tank City Observatory. And Joe recently published a piece titled, "The Business Climate is Always Bad, but It Never Matters." I discussed with Joe what's behind the business community's negative views about the economy, what the data actually shows in terms of how Oregon's economy is performing, and what it would take to really strengthen the Oregon's economy in a way that improves the lives of Oregonians. Before I get to my conversation with Joe, though, take a second to hit that like and subscribe button. You'd be helping others discover the show, and you'd be doing us a great favor. Okay, with that, here is my conversation with Joe Cortright. Hi, Joe. Thanks for coming on to Policy for the People.
Great to be here today, Juan Carlos.
So, Joe, you are an economist by trade. Can you tell us a little bit about your background and also about City Observatory, which is the think tank that you run?
Sure. I'm an economist. I do a lot of work on city and regional economies, what makes them tick. I run City Observatory, which is a little think tank that looks at the 50 or so largest metropolitan areas in the United States and analyzes their economic performance and focuses on a series of issues, including housing, transportation, poverty, economic development, and labor markets. Long time ago, I used to work for the state legislature in Oregon for about a dozen years. I ran their Committee on Trade and Economic Development. So I'm very well versed in the Oregon economy and economic development policy, both in Oregon and in other states, and actually in other countries as well.
So you recently published a piece in City Observatory called "The Business Climate is Always Bad, but It Never Matters." And I want to get into the substance of the piece in a moment, but I'm wondering if we can begin by you sort of setting the context for us of kind of why it was important to write this piece. What's going on out there that makes talking about the business climate a timely topic?
Yeah, I think the whole term business climate has been around for decades, and I think it's sort of a general claim or branding, a way of talking about actually political policies that we have that might or might not influence the economy. And there are a lot of people, particularly in the business community, who use business climate basically as just a rubric for their complaints about not wanting to pay taxes and not having to comply with regulations. And oftentimes there are valid complaints that people have, but a lot of time it's just that people would rather not pay taxes. 70% of Oregonians say they don't like taxes very much. Business people are not exceptions to that. And regulations can be burdensome sometimes, but then they also have benefits as well. And the whole discussion of business climate make some assumptions about the way economies operate, the way businesses operate that aren't particularly realistic and can lead to, I think, the wrong conclusions about what we need to do in terms of public policies.
So you say that, as reflected in the title of the piece, that the business community consistently complains about Oregon having a terrible business climate, but at the end of the day, those complaints don't really matter. Can you walk us through your argument, what the evidence shows?
Well, first of all, I think whenever you do these studies or ask open-ended questions about business climate, business people take that as an invitation to complain about taxes that they'd rather not pay, regulations they'd rather not comply with. So it's almost like complaining about the weather. It's something that is part of the background. It's better in my mind to understand what's happening with the economy, to look at actual economic indicators to see how well the economy is performing. And we have some good data for the Oregon economy that are put together not based on anecdotal complaints from local business people, but really objective economic comparisons based on data that are done by arguably impartial outsiders who rank how well cities and states are doing. And for the most part, they point to a long-term trajectory for Oregon in which it's doing relatively well.
I wonder if you can drill down a little bit into those details in terms of how Oregon is doing, some of the metrics that you cite in your piece.
Yeah, so one of the organizations that I follow pretty closely is the Brookings Institution, which, like City Observatory, looks at metropolitan economies across the country. It produces something every year called the Metro Monitor, which compares the 50 or so largest metropolitan areas in the United States, every metro area with 1 million or more population. And Portland's kind of right in the middle of that group with about 2.5 million people. And it ranks them on their economic performance, looking at a range of indicators, including things like income, productivity, joblessness, and the like. And basically, it found that the Portland metropolitan area was among the best performing metropolitan areas in the United States. So again, when you look at factors like that, it suggests that we have a relatively robust economy in the Portland metropolitan area.
And it was interesting reading that analysis by the Brookings Institution, in that it wasn't just the Portland metro economy that was doing well relative to its peers, but other cities in Portland as well came out looking pretty good in that analysis, right?
Well, yeah, actually, so what they do is they group metropolitan areas by population size. So Portland is in the category of the large metropolitan areas with 1 million or more population. We have other metropolitan areas, Salem, Eugene, Springfield, and Bend, which are in the sort of the small to medium-sized category, about 250,000 to 500,000 population. And every one of them is in the top 12 of the metropolitan areas, according to the Brookings ranking. And according to Brookings, the Bend metropolitan area has the strongest sort of small metropolitan economy ranking of any metro area in the United States. So it's kind of hard to believe that Oregon has a rotten business climate when we have the very best performing small metro area in the United States, and all of our metro areas tend to perform in the top dozen or so in their category, and they're probably 100 in that small to medium sized category, and as I said, about 50 in the largest category.
What kind of factors did the Brookings Institution look at in terms of sort of coming to this conclusion that cities here in Portland are doing quite well in some respects, or at least better than a lot of its?
Yeah. So, and that's a good question. So they look at a range of factors. And it's not just one number. So they look at things like job growth, productivity, as the output per worker, how productive workers are. They look at incomes, and they look at not just the aggregate income, but the median income and wages, to ask what level of wages people are earning. They look at equity indicators about how big the disparities are. They look at poverty rates, and it's sort of a composite of all of those factors that they look at in grading metropolitan areas.
You also spoke not just of how cities are doing, but the state as a whole. And in some respects, over the long haul, Oregon has done much better than most other states in a number of indicators. And I wonder if you can walk us through what you found when you did this analysis.
Yeah. So one of the things I should point out is back when I worked for the legislature in the 1980s, it was right after we experienced an absolutely devastating recession. About 10% of the Oregon economy went away between 1978 and 81. I went to work for the legislature in 1983. And we spent the next decade or more picking up the pieces from that recession. And I did a report for the Oregon legislature that said Oregon's big problem wasn't so much getting more jobs back. We got the jobs back as the national economy recovered, but our incomes lagged well below the national average. And our incomes, which had been really close to the national average, our per capita income, fell to about 10 points below the national average. And so, the focus then was, how do we raise wages and incomes for Oregonians, for Oregon workers and Oregon families? And that's continued to be a challenge for the last several decades. And it's really interesting to look back over the last 25 years, basically the century, from 2001 or so to 2026. And right now, Oregon's income is at 97% of the US average. That is, the average Oregonian earns about 97% of what the average American earns. That's as high as it has been any time in the last 25 years. And, if I had to pick just one number to kind of characterize how our economy is performing, I'd say let's look at that per capita income number, because that tells us a lot about sort of how, in the aggregate, our economy is performing. Now, a lot of other things we care about as well. We care about poverty rates, low income workers. We care about disparities. But if you don't have an economy that's performing well and providing high levels of income, it's hard to address those other issues. But the indication is that, again, doing as well as we've done in the last 20, 25 years.
And just for context, Oregonians have kind of dug themselves out of the deep hole that happened after that recession in the late 1970s and early 80s. So we have climbed back to close to the average of per capita personal income. It's the case, though, that most Americans actually are below. Most states are below the average. In that, it's only a handful of states that really drive the average higher. That's my understanding. I wonder if you have seen that information.
Yeah, it's kind of a one-tailed distribution, so that you have a few big states with high incomes like New York and California that are more populous and have higher levels of income, and that pushes up the average somewhat. So we're probably a bit above the median state. The typical state would have a somewhat lower income than we do, but again, we use that benchmark just to say how we're doing relative to average Americans, and that distribution that we're comparing to is pretty similar over time.
Mm-hmm. Since we're talking about the business climate, I wonder if you think that that's a phrase that a term that can even be properly defined for a state, in the sense that there are all kinds of businesses in the state that are affected differently by the regulatory system that we have, by the tax system that we have. So, for instance, my spouse has her own business. She's a sole practitioner. She's a mental health therapist. And how the tax system affects her is different than how the tax system affects the insurance companies with which she contracts, or not to say like an Intel, which is a major exporting company that deals with clients all over the world. So I wonder if it's even possible to talk about this notion of a business climate.
Yeah, you make a very good point, because every business is different. There are different sizes of business, different structures, corporations, sole proprietorships. There are people who are in different industries, and every state has a slightly different system of taxing businesses. Some states most states have sales taxes. We don't have sales taxes. One of the things people don't realize is that across the United States, businesses pay 42% of all the sales taxes that are charged. So if you're a business in a state with a sales tax like Washington, you pay sales taxes on most of the stuff that you have to buy for your business. And I think people don't necessarily recognize that there are all those differences. And so your mileage may vary from state to state. But the kind of the proof again is in the pudding in terms of the economic data, where we continue to have, by a lot of measures, a very robust economy. And the other thing is, I think business climate tends to get us focused on issues that people are complaining about that are not necessarily the most important issues. And just to go back to that per capita income number, we know that the single most important factor in determining a state's per capita income is how good a job it does of educating its citizens. We can explain about 70% of the variation in per capita income among states by knowing what fraction of the adult population has gotten a 4-year college degree. And that's really just an indicator for how well educated a state's population is. So basically, if you want to have a successful economy, you need to have a very well educated population. If you don't do a good job of that, it doesn't matter what tax breaks you have or how easy your regulations are. And similarly, states consistently that are very well educated tend to have very high incomes. So that's the single most important factor to be paying attention to. And what that means is, I think for public policy, 2 things. One, you got to do a great job of educating your kids and your population to make sure that they have the skills that they need to be productive and to compete in the modern economy we find ourselves in. And the second thing is you got to have a place that well-educated people want to live, want to stay, want to live, want to spend their lives and grow their families. And that's actually been one of Oregon's pretty distinctive advantages over the last 30, 40 years is the high quality of life that we have here, the environmental advantages that we have, great urban advantages that we have in many of our cities, including Portland. Those attract and retain a lot of talented people that then turn out to be the fuel that makes businesses be successful.
And Joe, you just published a new piece in City Observatory looking at new businesses coming to Oregon. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so one of the things that we pay particular attention to as a leading indicator of what way your economy is going is whether new businesses are getting started in your area. And for a lot of times they fly under the radar until they get fairly large. But there is a good source of data put together by the Economic Innovation Group in Washington, D.C., which ranks every one of the large metropolitan areas in the United States on how many new manufacturing businesses were created in the last 5 years. And the number one metropolitan area, large metropolitan area in the United States over the last 5 years has been Portland, the Portland-Vancouver metropolitan area. And this is not by a narrow margin, by a wide margin. The Portland area has about 250 more manufacturing businesses started over the last 5 years than you would expect if Portland just added new manufacturing businesses at the same rate as the typical large metropolitan area. So that's a very hopeful sign because, there's this mythology that businesses move a lot from place to place. That's not true. Most businesses start in one place, grow there, and stay there for their entire existence. So if you want to have a successful economy with lots of businesses, the way to do that is to be good at creating new businesses. And again, that's a leading indicator that I put a lot of faith in, and it runs counter to this idea that somehow we have a lousy business climate.
Given that, I wonder why it is that right now, in this particular moment, you are hearing so much from the business community, especially the lobby that represents Oregon's largest businesses. They really have been pounding the table on this notion, as you say, that Oregon has a terrible business climate. What do you think is going on right now that you're hearing so much about it and hearing it repeated in the press without much reflection as to whether that it's connects with reality?
Well, I think a lot of it is just self-interested and self-serving. It's like, I'd rather pay lower taxes and I'd rather have less regulation. So I'm going to use the fact that people are worrying about the economy to make that the prescription for what we should do. We should make life easier for businesses. There's no evidence that those kind of tax cuts or whatever regulations they're talking about would make very much difference to the long-term health of the economy. And the evidence actually is that having a very high quality of life, having, for example, great environmental protections to protect the quality of life and which help develop our distinctive advantage, our distinctive attraction, particularly to well-educated people. Those things are really important, particularly going forward.
One person who seems to have bought into the idea that Oregon's business climate is in bad shape and that it is something to be concerned about is Governor Kotek. She, some months ago, released a document called the Prosperity Roadmap. And in it, she sets a number of key economic goals for Oregon, one of them being placing Oregon in the top 10 of a state business ranking put together by CNBC. I wonder what you think about this idea of business rankings generally, but also more importantly, the Governor Kotek's Prosperity Roadmap. What's your take on those?
Well, I think if you're getting your economic advice from a television or a cable news network, you ought to look very, very carefully at what indicators they're using. And the CNBC index, which I've looked at, rates states very highly on something they call business friendliness. And if you look at the states that are the most quote unquote business friendly, they're pretty consistently a lot of low income states that pay families low wages. Just for example, Oregon's lowest paid workers, what we call the 10th percentile, the lowest 10th percentile of workers, they make more than the 10th percentile workers in the rest of the United States, about 15% more. That's in large part because we have had and continue to have a relatively high minimum wage here in Oregon. We made a decision to have a high minimum wage. The states that get marked really high on business friendliness have very low minimum wages, and they pay their lowest wage workers the least. So I think, again, if you're gonna rely on one of these rankings, you should know what's behind it, and it's really espousing a set of values that I think most Oregonians don't agree with, and I don't think there's been a lot of controversy about the minimum wage in Oregon being of benefit. It puts more money in the hands of working Oregonians and particularly helps the wages of low and moderate income Oregonians, which benefits them directly, and then also provides more spending power that goes into the economy that helps propel businesses.
If we're talking about what it truly would take to create prosperity here in Oregon, you already alluded to it. A lot of it goes to education. I'm wondering what else are important factors in terms of sort of creating broadly shared prosperity that's not flowing to just the relative few, but to the vast majority of Oregonians. And what kind of policies do we need to achieve that?
Yeah, that's a big question. I think the most important one, as it turns out, is education and skills, and increasing that's about not just college but lifelong learning. How do we enable people to deal with the increasing complexity of the modern world? And so that's kind of got to be job one. And then you have to recognize that well-educated people, highly skilled people are highly mobile. They have lots of options, and having a place that's got a distinctive quality of life. And I think that's the other thing that I particularly recommend here is there is no generic strategy that makes sense for economic development. You have to have a strategy that works for your state's particular advantages. We can't out Mississippi, nor should we want to. We don't have the same advantages as, say, California or New York. We have to work with the particular advantages that Oregon has. And I think we know what some of those are. I think our Governor Tom McCall espoused them, like 5 decades ago when he was talking about Oregon and saying, basically, we need to build on our quality of life, our commitment to the environment, and then a lot of the social policies that assure that everybody has equal opportunity. The other thing I'd say is, particularly in light of what's going on at the federal level, where the federal government is very anti-immigrant and very anti-international trade. Those are two things that have really benefited the Oregon economy, is our openness to immigration and our participation in international trade. We're like the 6th most exporting state in the United States. So having a state that stands up to a federal administration that is espousing these anti-immigration and anti-trade values, I think is really important to demonstrate to ourselves, to the world, to business people everywhere that we still espouse, the same values that America has always stood for, and that really have underpinned our economic success for 200 years.
If the most impactful thing that the state can do to improve our economic outcomes is education, that may take additional resources to pay for making college more accessible, to having universal preschool, which, by the way, Governor Kotek, to her credit, has launched a study group that will look into creating a system of universal preschool here in Oregon. It seems that doing some of those things requires money. It requires resources, which, of course, the way the public sector pays for things is through taxes usually. So it seems that we should be talking about smart ways of raising revenue, not going the opposite way and talking about cutting taxes for corporations. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. The critical question is how do you pay for these public services? I think there's a very powerful economic case in favor of pre-K. It's helpful to kids. We know it improves lifelong learning opportunities. We know it is particularly helpful to kids from disadvantaged backgrounds and poor communities who don't necessarily have the opportunities and resources that other kids do. We know it's a huge factor for working families to enable both parents to be able to work. It's a cost of living factor because of the high cost of childcare. So there are a lot of reasons to think about doing that and investing in it. So that's a real positive. And then taxes. Every state in the United States levies about taxes that amount to between about 9 and 11% of the total income in the state, whether it's sales taxes, property taxes, income taxes, business taxes, what have you. Oregon has a somewhat different mix, but I think we're in the just above 20, maybe like 18th highest in terms of taxes. So it's there are a lot of different ways to extract that money from people and businesses, but we're not talking about a hugely different amount of money than other states are charging. And I think the challenge is to get political agreement around what's the best way to levy those taxes. And in a way, when people say business climate, they're making a surrogate argument for, I don't think I should pay those taxes. I think somebody else should pay them. And I think it's a legitimate debate to have, but we shouldn't automatically assume that there's a lot of credence or give a lot of credence to that idea that you can't tax them because it would devastate the economy somehow.
Joe, I wonder if you have any final thoughts on this idea of the business climate, and also, perhaps more importantly, what we can do here in Oregon to really improve the quality of life of our people.
Well, again, I think we have to recognize that there isn't, like I said, a generic economic strategy that you can pursue. And I think that's the concern I have about business climate and something like this CNBC ranking. It implies that if you're just the cheapest version of what any other state could offer, that will somehow make you more competitive. And I think we all understand that Oregon is different from other places. And rather than run from those differences, we ought to celebrate and build on those differences. What are the unique strengths, the distinctive advantages that we have that nobody else can outcompete? How do we celebrate the things that one of my friends who was an advisor to the governor of Arizona said, what is it that makes this place first, best, or only in something? Because those are the sources of defensible long-term competitive advantage. So we should think about the things that make Oregon the best Oregon it can be, and not worry about whether we're 1 or 2% cheaper or more expensive than some other place.
Great. And Joe, if the listeners want to read your work, where can they go?
They can go to cityobservatory.org. That's just a real simple website. And we have a weekly newsletter that we do as well that's free to anybody who wants to sign up for it.
Well, Joe Cortright, thank you so much.
Thanks so much for the opportunity to chat.